Hi everyone again, and thank you for taking out the time to be over here because I do recognize that to be here in this moment, you like to say no to something else in your life, even partially and briefly. So just think that for granted, I'm really thankful and for the generosity to be over here with us for the next minutes as you can be and to be in a discussion about what does it mean to engagement and voice for climate justice, how it has been done. Just a brief overview for the agenda today. I will be doing a brief opening about the session, which should be followed by a presentation by Pire, and then a discussion between Niharika and Pire, after which the floor will be open to all of you as the audience member until the end of the session itself. And briefly about Men Engage Alliance, if this is your first time just being introduced, if you're not aware before, we are a global alliance that has 1,000 plus members across 90 plus countries. And one of the reasons that we have been able to work so vastly across the globe and come together is because we have worked on being in solidarity with each other. And I wanted to start the session by talking about solidarity because it is important. Because it is important to be in conversation and support of others that we are working with, and that we are there for them in their times of needs because um, often I take for granted what it means to be in solidarity with others, and I am not verbally and explicitly thanking that. So I want to just take this moment to center that and also invite you in the chat if you can to share who are you in solidarity with, for whom does your heart bleed and your soul speaks these days, like you're like this is something I am in solidarity with. Personally, for me, I'm in solidarity with the workers, the daily wage laborers, the people of Sudan who continue to face war and displacement, for the people of Kashmir who are denied their civil liberties, with the Gen Z protesters across South Asia, as we have seen in the recent months, who have organized for a right to life with dignity. I'm in solidarity with indigenous people, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people on whose lands I'm currently residing on as a settler. I am in solidarity with the Black people, the African diaspora, especially who are told to get over their centuries of trauma from slavery within a few years because that is over with, even though we know that the prison system continues to be uh, ongoing form of slavery, intensified in many different ways. I am in solidarity with the people in Gaza and Palestine who face the ongoing apartheid and genocide even now. I continue to be in solidarity with the queer community and especially the trans community that has faced increased onslaught in recent years globally. And what being in solidarity means is in practice is something that I'm still figuring out, and it changes a bit over time. But I also wanted to start with this again because when we are talking about engaging men and boys, there is a spectrum on which this work happens, right? And okay, and thank you for people sharing in the chat about who you are in solidarity with. Thank you, Barry, for being sorry with people of uh, Colombia, with the far right, March 20, who signed as president. Isar mentions all the people, indigenous people affected by the climate change laws. And Pranav, thank you for saying yes to solidarity with animals as well, right? With the more than human world in solidarity with uh, the earth itself, definitely. And just to come back to this, so when talking about engaging men and boys, I just want to really center this that it is a spectrum. The work is a spectrum on which this is done. And at the heart of this work really is recognizing that how we want them to be co-strugglers uh, within our movement for gender justice, right? And sometimes you start as an ally where you recognize that, okay, something is wrong and I need to do a little bit of support, right? And from there you maybe starting to recognize that, oh, it's not just like I need to do gender justice work for someone else's benefit, for the benefit of the queer community or women or indigenous people, but no, this work has internal, intrinsic and meaningful benefit for me as well as a man, as a gender being myself. And that can lead you into really taking on appropriate levels of responsibility and accountability, because once again in your heart of hearts you're like, no, this is also my struggle as well. I'm a co-struggler in this movement. And that allows you to once again deepen and expand your understanding of how you are as a man, a gendered being, and how you need to be in allyship and in solidarity with others, right? Because we are looking at systematic change when we are talking about this work, and not from this individual man at the community level, but also from many more structural positions of power who recognize the impact that they can have. And and the gender transformative work is work for me that happens when we reach the hearts of others, when we reach their hearts and able to see how they are joining us as co-strugglers together in the work that we're doing, and that we need all of the different ways and skills and gifts that we bring to this work to be together. And for me right now, thank you again, everyone, for saying who you are in solidarity with in the chat. Wonderful to read, wonderful to read, really. And yes, definitely. Thank you for what to say, I guess, with the the many women who just fear being around men and experience violence from them as well, because that is the reality of our life. Talking over here, and just sorry, then just before I hand it over to um, Pierre and Niharika, just want you to give a brief introduction for Pierre and Niharika. So Niharika is a intersectional anti-caste feminist and a law graduate, and has been associated with diverse social sector initiatives since 2019. They joined the Gender Lab as a facilitator for the Boys program in 2022, and currently lead the Gender Lab's Gender and Masculinities Academy, through which they work with different social sector organizations to strengthen approaches on working with men and boys on gender and masculinities. They are passionate about exploring the intersection of masculinities with queerness, caste, climate, and more. And they engage with these themes through writing as meaningful reflection and advocacy. Pierre Smith Khanan has a BA in politics, philosophy, and history, and MA in political ecology, degrowth, environmental justice. And he is currently completing his PhD in ecological masculinities, environmental education. Amazing. We went for an academia and the other in more hands-on learning. Pire has a deep interest in education and encountering novel ways in which students and teachers can learn together in an environment free of fear and competition. He has developed and taught curricula in formal and non-formal educational settings for teenagers and young adults, launched a podcast series entitled Sustainable Masculinities, and authored papers on the same subject, and directed feature-length documentary titled Fairy Tales of Growth, exploring degrowth and climate activism. And I hope we will have time to touch on some of them. And with that, thank you so much everyone for joining. And Pire, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kuram, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you so much for having me. I very much look forward to the conversation after this presentation. Also building on the previous two sessions that you've already had. So yeah, as Kuram said, no, I've been working for the past 4 years on this topic of ecological masculinities and environmental activism. And I guess I approach it from a different angle in the sense that I'm looking at existing environmental movements and men within those movements. And the question is kind of like, to what extent do they challenge or uphold hegemonic masculinity? And how does the environmentalism or the movement itself affect that and affect their performances of masculinity and their views on gender? So I interviewed men in the UK and in Colombia. But today I'm just going to focus on one of the groups of men I interviewed who are part of this urban agroecological network of gardens in Cali, Colombia. And if we have time, we can touch upon other points later. So yeah, Red Hack, as it's called, the network of agroecological gardens in Cali. They self-define as being born out of a collective will to recognize ourselves within the territory as actors who materialize food sovereignty and popular power aimed at buen vivir, the liberation of Mother Earth, food sovereignty, popular and solidarity economy, and the self-determination of the people. So there are they have 50 or so gardens spread across the city. Here in the top right, you can see the map of Cali and where the gardens are located, the majority of which are in the kind of most impoverished neighborhoods of Cali to the east and to the foothills in the west. And most of the men I interviewed were actually grew up and come from these working class neighborhoods themselves. So I guess there's a kind of strong, there's quite a diversity of people who are engaged in these urban garden network, including working class peoples, but also students, university, different age groups, etc. But they're very much a grassroots movement that took off in the last 5 years. So what do? They organize once a week a minga, like a kind of collective work share, where members from all the other gardens come to one of the garden to help out with whatever work it's been doing. They host a community pot, an ancestral practice of cooking and sharing food together, as well as having a knowledge exchange, which could be, a compost workshop or how to grow a particular variety of seed, etc. And then the following week, they'll call for a minga in a different garden, and then everyone will go to that one. So it's really based on principles of solidarity and reciprocity, kind of very much at the heart of this network. And what's really important is their stance towards institutions and towards the idea of sustainable development. So they're very clear about, they don't want the state or the municipality to just come with soil, seeds, and tools, which they see as just another smokescreen to meet an indicator of the SDGs. No, what they want is for the state to be providing fundamental structural solutions that facilitate the autonomy of communities with a profound transformation in our forms of material consumption, food, energy, and the ways in which we relate to nature. I want you to hold on to this because this is really important in terms of how this then engages in the process of ecologizing masculinity, this stance towards sustainability. So in terms of masculinities, as I said, most of the men I interviewed come from these impoverished neighborhoods where the image of the narco is really prevalent, and a lot of boys and young men kind of look up to that as something to aspire to in a way, and also as an exit strategy, a quick, easy exit strategy out of their situation. So on the one hand, you have this narco masculinity. On the other hand, the other prevalent role or role model of masculinity is kind of sound and serious man who emphasizes work, family, and studies. But both of these are premised on the notion of virility, homophobia, and the subordination of women. So of course, the gardens, the huertas, as they say in Spanish, are first and foremost an option to exit where they're from, to kind of escape in a way this background. So Hector Vizcaino, for instance, who himself was part of a gang involved in killings, etc., says how they push you to drugs, to death, to blood. So I try to get away from all that because I've already suffered a lot from that. And so he left all that behind and entered the Huertas, and that was the start of his environmental activism. Other men were not involved in gang activities, but were, of course, affected by them. So on the one hand, the Huertas can be seen as this kind of safe haven. And on the other hand, they're also sites where people can care and healing takes place. A lot of the men spoke about how for them it was very therapeutic. Being there was very therapeutic. On the one hand, for the kind of relations of solidarity amongst other people, but also their relation with plants, which has, I think, important gendered connotations, right? So Hector Ibanez, another man, 22-year-old, spoke about how the work of plants, because of its delicacy, its detail orientedness, is attributed a lot to women. Women are the ones who do that kind of work. But we can see that in the Huerta, we men can also take care and find something of that which is named as feminine, but can also be general characteristics. So there was this kind of safe space, if you like, for men to explore different aspects of themselves which may be termed feminine from by the outside world, and also spoke about how they didn't care necessarily about how others perceived them. So sort of resilience, let's say, to outside perceptions. And finally, some of the men were talking about very explicitly how the hegemonic ideal did not apply to them, or they rejected it, right? They did not identify with that hegemonic or dominant ideal of what a man should be in Colombian society. So Javier Chinchina spoke about how I also know that the patriarchy is so structural that one does not fail to comply. So it's like a daily exercise. Alexander Rosas talks about how he wants to destroy that ideal of the macho man. But obviously, I have a lot of work to do. Now, what's interesting about these two quotes is that they are signaling in a way that no matter how much you as an individual might change, we as men are still embedded within a patriarchal society that will continue to confer benefits onto us by virtue of being men, and will also continually try and reinscribe us in the patriarchal order, right? So it's a daily exercise that might not even have an end in sight, right? It's not like, oh, I've reached the point of realization and I'm done with my work. No, it's a continuous process. Of course, not all the men spoke in those terms. Two in particular, William and Alvaro, spoke much more, embraced, let's say, much more traditionally coded masculine characteristics and views. So William self-defined as a man who hammers away, a warrior, a player who likes women, liquor, and partying. Alvaro, similarly, when I asked him about his views on men and masculinity, started speaking about women as having a lot of capacity. They're very capable, but they need a man by their side, right? So I tried to understand what were the differences between these two groups of men in a way. And here there's like a correlation that emerged in terms of their values and their motivations for activism. So whilst all the men embraced food sovereignty as a key motivation for their activism in the middle here, men like Alvaro and William also saw their activism as an economic opportunity, where they would produce food that they could potentially sell, helping them and their families, and also were very favorable towards institutional interventions, to like digitizing their garden to have higher productivity yields, etc. And so these men, what Martin Holtman has termed equal modern masculinities, also correlated more with this kind of more traditional, we could say, compliance with hegemonic masculinity. Whereas on the other hand, you had men who saw things like buen vivir, which is like this indigenous Andean relational ontology, as much more central to their activism, and remained highly skeptical towards sustainable development, and basically the development paradigm that their state is embedded within, and kind of rejected that. So these men on the right hand side here showed more resistance to hegemonic masculinity. I wondered, all right, what distinguishes them? No, on the one hand, William and Alvaro on the left-hand side were both from working class backgrounds and had not gone to further education, so potentially that was a factor there. However, other men were from working class backgrounds and were on the right-hand side, and one in particular, Hector Vizcaino, the one who was involved in gangs and stuff, he had also not been to further education, but aligned more on the right. And one interesting difference here is that Hector had been involved much longer in environmental activism than William and Alvaro, suggesting that perhaps longevity in the environmental movement may foster ecological masculinities. And here's the key point for me is what is that environmental movement and what values and analyses of the ecological crisis underpin it, right? So the network of agroecological gardens in Cali, holding Buen Vivir at its heart, is in discussion with things like ecofeminism, feminist economics of care, the coloniality of power. So if all these things are what are informing your environmental movement, then of course, the longer you're in that movement, the more likely it is you're going to start perceiving these structures of domination across the board, not only in the realm of environmentalism, but in the realm of gender and the realm of coloniality, etc. So for me, I think that's the key takeaway that to hold on to, in the sense when we're thinking about working or engaging men and boys in processes of ecological masculinities, is what kind of environmental discourse are we holding at the heart of it, what's at the heart. And we should maintain, I think, a critical stance towards institutional discourses of sustainable development, for instance. It's often spoken about marginalized men and masculinities, that they have a tendency to respond to their situation of marginalization by developing like a hyper masculinity or a protest masculinity, which narco masculinities would be a very good example of. But that's not always the case. I think what some of them and I interviewed show is that these same marginalized men can also confront the gender order alongside the economic and epistemic orders too. This is what the masculinities practitioner in Colombia, Ruiz Arroyave, speaks of in terms of liberation masculinities, which is an attempt to hold all these structures of oppression together as one. It's not just a case of engaging against ecocide or engaging against for gender justice, but holding all of these at the same time together. So yeah, I'm gonna stop there.
Whatever you feel comfortable with, and thank you for that wonderful current presentation. To really go into the depth of what does it look like to work on the ground with men and boys and different ways that they're working with, to understand their own position in the patriarchal structure in which they came into being, right? Um, Before I ask any questions to the two of you, Niharika, do you have any reactions?
I think while we were having an initial conversation for this, something I was expressing was that I don't feel like academia in masculinities speaks a lot with practice. That conversation becomes missing a lot of the time. And as I was listening to Pierre, I realized that a lot of what I've experienced in practice actually complements what you're saying. And um, they kind of walk hand in hand together. So I'm actually really excited listening to this because I feel like a lot of what I have to say is already in some ways come up. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Then the first question to really get us started was like I had to the both of you was really that many of us who are here in this room right now, we want to talk to the men in our lives, right? Our uncles, our cousins, our friends, colleagues, community members about climate justice and gender justice. But we often find like they're very skeptical or disengaged or they devalue these conversations, right? So from your experience, like working with men and boys or boys specifically, given the focus with the gender lab on adolescent boys, when framing stories or entry points have been actually useful in starting these conversations? And what have you seen that tends to just shut the conversation down even before it has started? Niharika, if you could go first.
Sure. Thanks, Kuram. Um, So, just to position what we do at the Gender Lab, we've been holding a program on the ground with adolescent boys in India for about 9 years now. And the program essentially talks about gender, masculinities, sexuality, care. And the boys do certain action based projects in their community to better understand how masculinities look in their lives, beyond which we also engage men in mixed groups, and older men, that is, as educators and as NGO leaders. So anything that I would share would be in the purview of uh, what we've understood about gender masculinities work with men and boys through this range of programs. Um, I think to start with, the previous two iterations of this series of webinars had um, a bunch of my colleagues speak about what we can do to make men feel like gender is a shared priority for them, which is something that Kuram also opened with the triangle. And for us too, in our work, I think this has been a great entry point to engage men and boys, really breaking down the question and asking them, what does it mean to you to be a man or a boy in your very unique context? And very often, this brings out the simple question of what does it mean for you to be a man or a boy, brings out reflections on provider pressure, protector burden, the pressure to look and act in certain socially acceptable ways. And yes, of course, I think at this point, uh, we've had a lot of experience of suspicion, skepticism, disengagement among some men, some boys that that don't fall into, I think, Pierre's idea of, those men who don't subscribe to hegemonic masculinities. So men who have bought in more, or boys who have bought in more to the idea of hegemonic masculinities and how it benefits them. And I would speculate and say from experience that the skepticism is only fueled by the online narratives being pushed now over the past years by the manosphere. Um, which we've encountered time and again in our work with boys kind of retreating into themselves and really opposing any conversation about gender coming in from a group of young adults because they feel like it opposes the narrative of the manosphere, which they buy into far more. But beyond that, especially when we work with men across different contexts in India who are a bit older, the resistance is also fueled by the perception of a non-profit organization or an educator going in to talk about masculinities or ask them to ask questions. For instance, a few months ago, we were in a tribal context in a village in Rajasthan in Western India, and men in the communities that we were speaking to were really worried that we are people from NGOs who've come to convince women to not wear protective veils or ghungats anymore, which are a sign of community pride and honor among the women there. And they're expected to cover up their faces and entire bodies to protect the honor and pride of the community or the family. So that kind of skepticism and fear among communities that uh, this is the kind of shift that organizations would bring, kind of stop the conversation right there. And there is a need to bring out creative ways to solve these very initial backlash kind of situations before we move on to more complex gender conversations. I feel another entry point for several organizations, including us, is care. Um, as we were discussing before, I believe. And in our work with men and boys, we do find that they deeply care for their families. They deeply care for the women who are close to them. They are hurt when they realize that they've never thought about what is mom's favorite food or the pain in which she works when she's menstruating and walks long distances to fetch firewood, fetch water. And we also find that their dreams are also colored by care. They want to build pakka, proper cement houses for their parents when they grow up. Um, but then the catch has been often that these feelings of care also fall within the purview of a protector role or a provider role that they're taught to fulfill, and it's very actionable within those roles. So the catch is that then there is a need to design conversations and activities and enter from a critical inquiry of how are you expressing the care that you're feeling and how could you do that when you grow up. What are the inquiries you're holding as a young person to really question what you do with these feelings of care and how they're affecting you as a young man. Um, Lastly, I think with particular regard to climate and masculinities over the past year or so, the city that we work most in, which is Mumbai, saw a lot of activism because the government proposed to tear down a lot of the mangrove forests, which are the last defense system of the city against flooding that already happens every year. And there was a citizens movement to oppose this. So our young fellows, who were three young women and two young men, participated with us in the protests against the mangrove deforestation. And there, through the experiences at the protest and the conversations we had, just with this group of five young people who were just venturing into these activist spaces, we realized that the young women are already showing up with a lot of care for the planet and what would happen to the neighborhoods, what would happen to the city if the macros were cut down. But it took a lot more for the men to think about this, and they were immediately advocating for infrastructure development over environment protection. Um, so while the larger context of this is that the city floods every year and the young men also live in communities that are precariously situated in places that flood a lot, we realize that due to the access, mobility, and conditioning that the young men have been brought up with, they feel that a road might be more important than the macros are. So this is one small example from a conversation with five young people that we had, and we do intend to deepen this conversation a little with them. But then, very initially, this is what we've understood. Contrasting with which, one of the organizations in Rajasthan that we work in partnership with, we did see a majorly men-led organization come in and um, try to solve the problem of invasive species of weeds in their community and how they're affecting farmers by spending a lot of time and resources to figure out how to use these weeds in a way that they can create products out of them to create employment opportunities for women from tribal contexts in Rajasthan. And there, I think the question we bumped into is that is this amount of care that we're seeing among this group of older men coming from how close they live and work with the land, with the yield, and with nature, as opposed to what happens in cities and how far away people are from the ecology there? Yes. So those are a few entry points, I think.
Thank you. Wonderfully shared.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I think Annika has a lot more experience than I do in working closely with groups of boys and men. I mean, what I can say from my side, I guess my experience is on the one hand with my friends and family, and on the other hand, participating in men's workshops um, that align a bit closer to, let's say, the mythopoetic approach to men's work, as well as novel takes on those workshops. And finally, offering workshops myself in environmental activist spaces, which I don't know how much they can tell us or inform us, because they are with men who are already seriously engaged in degrowth, in particular activism, and so are quite open to exploring these kind of questions themselves. But I guess, so I think for me, the first entry point is to be super honest and open, and in a way meet men in particular where they're at, in a way. So not enter the conversation with an idea of what you want to impose onto them, but enter the conversation with, all right, where are you guys at to begin with? And this is something I saw in the workshops, the men's workshops in the UK, with both the mythopoetic approaches and the kind of much more feminist inspired approaches, which was to do, almost collective trauma therapy with men, but starting really with a position of care, right? And doing there's a lot of work that has to be done to open men up to start to become emotionally literate in a way and share. And so I think that is a crucial first step in a way, that then enables you to potentially start having discussions of gender inequality and systemic inequalities. It was very interesting that, the kind of more mythopoetic workshop didn't. So we reached the stage of very much being open and having our hearts wide open, but then not going into this more critical understanding of gender issues. Whereas the more feminist inspired workshop that I went to did precisely that. And it was amazing to see how men in our conversations outside of the workshop spaces were centered around questions of patriarchy, were centered around questions of, deep pain about women's pain and what they suffer and go through. So yeah. And in a way, this connects to the workshops that I've done with Ben in degrowth spaces, which is they were very open to hearing about the necessity for men to change, let's say. But it takes a long time, again, to reach this first stage of opening up within a group of men. And so what was found lacking there was we never have enough time, it seems, to move on to the kind of more structural analyses of power. So I think for me, what would be key, is yes, we need to engage men and boys in these conversations, but it has to be the sustained engagement. It's like we can't expect to do anything in one conversation. Like it has to be a sustained engagement. And so in that sense, it's perhaps best to focus our efforts on people who are very close to us, nephews or uncles or whatever, so that the conversation can progress at its own pace. Yeah. Then one last thing I'll say about what Harika mentioned about the particular difficulty of engaging boys today with the influence of the manosphere is I would think a good strategy would be to stop pitching it as a zero-sum game. Like I see a lot of this. It's like men and boys saying women have taken all these wins and we're the ones losing out. And I think that narrative has to be flipped over and be like, wait a minute, it's not a zero-sum game here. And in fact, we're in the same boat, and there are common denominators such as capitalism, infinite growth, ecocide, which are affecting all of us actually. And so let's turn our attention to those things and be on the same team here, as opposed to thinking that we're the ones us men are losing out and they're benefiting.
Thank you both so much for these wonderful talks. And I just read there have been recent wildfires where I am. So as I read this post, like say very nicely, that you are closer to being a climate refugee than you are being to billionaire. So please recognize that reality. Um, I wanted to open up the floor to the audience really now at this point. And if you have a question, yes, please raise your hand and we will take questions whenever. If you can write them in the chat, that would also be great. Um, Nicole, yes, please. What is your comment, question?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that last point that Pierre just made about it not being a zero-sum game. But I find sometimes when I'm having conversations, not with necessarily colleagues, but friends who are less informed, they dig their heels in a lot around that zero-sum game. And I get that, sorry, let me just preface myself. From the Caribbean, so we are post-colonial, so we have all these influences coming in. And some of the men really feel they've bought into this notion that they have to be protector and they have to be provider. And of course, feminism is just taking all this away. I find it very difficult to get them to understand, and at least in some instances, that feminism has made their lives a little better. That is a hard sell. But how do we really just get them to understand that we're all really working towards the same goal? Because I've definitely come to understand that both capitalism and patriarchy are definitely things that we have to dismantle to get to where we want to get to. So any notions about the really stubborn ones or anybody else, about the really stubborn ones who really want to dig, and I will caveat it by saying they're not reading. They're still using the old information they have because they really believe that the new information is tainted so much by feminism that they're being tricked into at least I don't want to be tricked into thinking that feminism is this thing that's, is only for us women and not for them as well. Any pointers from anybody would be great. Thanks.
Who wants to go first?
I don't know. I can go first. I don't have much of an answer to that, apart from to be careful where you put your energy. If they're really so entrenched, then is there even a positive outcome that can come from the conversation? I don't know. And I also think it depends on how close they are. Like I have two very close friends in particular who I've discovered have become climate deniers and who have very traditional views on gender, let's say. And my reaction was actually to keep the conversation open because they're close friends and I didn't want to lose a friendship. And maybe on the long run, something will come of that. I don't know. But certainly the kind of attempt to engage in a rational conversation doesn't work with people who are that entrenched. And I think it's a waste of energy. And actually what I think what we are more in need of is, how are those people, how do they get to those positions? Again, the influence of the manosphere, and there are so many personalities and so much media time given to this other side of the story. What we, I think, are lacking a bit is where are our personalities, where are our TikTok videos, where are our influencers who are talking about our side of the story? That is where I think we should put our energy in. Yeah.
Well, yes, certainly that. And I think I can come in from um, our experience of holding men and boys, as I was saying, as they grapple with what it means for them to love somebody and care for somebody, because it all comes down to that. That is it just providing and protecting that allows me to express care, and what is the framework of masculinities that I'm living within, and how to broaden that. I think it's undeniable that the impact of the manosphere is kind of creating or giving men frameworks for success, affirming their perceptions of the masculine self in this political economy, as Pierre was saying, um, and kind of reproducing at the same time the dominant patriarchal narratives, which are re-indoctrinating men to already present masculine behaviors in society, which are already they're already socialized by families, by the media, as Pierre is saying, by their schools, by all spaces around them. So this is a platform for re-indoctrination. So it's not anything new that is happening through the digital manosphere. Media for eons has been feeding a certain form of masculinity through various role models to men. I think that is one thing to for us to face as practitioners, because we are at this point intimidated by the manosphere as something new, but the narratives are not new. They're very old. They're just being reproduced at a mass scale. And we have been thinking about these strategies for the last 30, 40 years. But what I want to point out is that try to respond to the question, that the one thing that is most devalued by the narratives of the manosphere is care and connection, because it pushes the agenda that you be a lone wolf, no care, no connection, don't express anything, and that is the formula to success. But self discovery and understanding how one would like to be cared for and how one would like to express care is what I have seen among older men, especially, to work beautifully in terms of their connection with masculinities, work with feminist movement. So I think that is where spaces for self-discovery is what I would say are in practice kind of counteracting for us the influence of manosphere messaging.
Thank you. Mark, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be part of the conversation. I'm here in Glasgow. The sun is shining, which is quite an unusual experience. But I wanted to there's so many fantastic points, but the interconnectivity of the issues we talk about capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, and more militarization I think is such a huge issue, and how those that they intersect and to support each other as a kind of paradigm of violence and destruction. And looking for ways forward in a kind of collective way, I've recently discovered this the idea of future generation assemblies, and I would just recommend this report, which came out in 2025, but it's got a beautiful example of how people can be brought together to experience the opportunity to bring in kind of other than human life, to bring in future generations, to bring in perspectives that are certainly at very best marginalized through the neoliberal education agenda. And these are the spaces for hope. And it's the fact that there was more and more violence against, and in the UK, people are being jailed now for protesting, supporting Palestine action, protesting against genocide. So we see that as people react more and more against the outcomes of the current system, the system becomes more violent, becomes more authoritarian, becomes it can no longer use the kind of hegemonic power of consumerism in the system to do this. And I think for me, that's where the learning from indigenous, or indigenous groups and individual indigenous cultures that have never been neoliberal. That have remained within the kind of value systems of connection to nature, and that understanding is really the way forward. So just loving being part of this conversation, but also very keen to mainstream it. And I'm part of the kind of White Ribbon Scotland kind of initiative. And again, I think we need to be using the learning from Pierre's work and from others, from Narukita, about the way of connection to nature is in men as much as it is in women, as much as it is in trans people, as it is in non-binary, whatever we want to say. It is the real soul of our species that we share with us. So for me, that is the entry point, and one that really, with the damage that we've done to Mother Earth, we need to learn that lesson as quickly as we can and use it as a foundation to build a global movement against the hegemony of militarization and authoritarianism. Thank you. Sorry for speaking so long.
Thank you for your contributions, Mark. It's really wonderful to hear the passion and the intergenerational perspective that you're also bringing, like, and carry center to the work like we do. Does anyone else have any questions or comments they would like to make? I mean, I have a whole list, but this is all of you made the time to be here. I really want to respect that and honor that. And is there anything you want to really ask about or discuss, please? Yeah, John?
What I really like is when Manuel said we should be where the people are at. And to me, that is so important. It also means that we should try to stay away from words that upset people too quickly and too easily without understanding what I mean. Whenever I do, trainings or workshops, or even I'm now part of a new food garden initiative, and I've not even raised the word gender. I've not talked about patriarchy. I've not talked about capitalism. But with the group that we are doing this garden, it's mixed ages, mixed colors, mixed men and women, and of different diversities, I guess. We're actually starting this farm as a food farm. We're all subscribers, but I feel for the time being, I shouldn't even be talking about these issues because power issues will come up. And the power issues will come up quite soon because we have as a principle that you are a subscriber for a particular number of people in your household. So if you're one, you can only pluck, or you do your own plucking and harvesting, you only pluck to your needs. Now, the question will be, and that will come up I suppose, particularly in the autumn and when many people are really back and getting their things for their families, are people able to just take what they need, or is there more? Oh, let's preserve some. Let's keep some for next week, or have some extra for because the wintertime we won't have any vegetables. Now that will start the opportunities for discussing at the coffee table because we have a table right in the middle of the farm where you can sit under a canopy and have coffee or tea and discuss things what's happening because we need to engage as a group. And at this moment we are 120 users because that's how much the land can feed us. Next year it will be 250, but for the time being is this smaller number. Whoever comes will then be part of the discussion on how do we actually make sure we distribute equally according to need and of course, according to preference as well, because not everyone likes the same vegetables, so to speak. It's all vegetarian, it's all vegetables, of course. But then that will actually start the discussion on, okay, can we stop? Can we only produce and take what we need? Are we able to do that? And do we have a discussion about that? And to me, it's a new conversation. And I won't even for the time being start all the other big things and structural issues. That will come later. But the farm was started, by the way, by two men. Man who came out of the business world. Actually, one is a financial planner, which to me meant also at least this person will look at, are we actually carefully doing something nice, or is it a romantic idea that we have this food farm and it will collapse in no time? So from that perspective, it's really useful. It's also two young men who got frustrated with their high-paid jobs and who are now actually, one of them is facing his parents' anger that he's left his hard-paid job and is now doing something that his heart fulfills him. And he's actually realizing now in discussions with us as volunteers and users and members of this group that actually he's actually very happy. He's much happier than he was before. And he has to deal with the frustration. So he's actually going against the need of the traditional provider, getting big jobs and big salaries and all that. That's just what I wanted to share.
Thank you, John. Once again, a wonderful one example to hear about how there is a time and place for different conversations, and everything will need to be so confrontational in the very first meeting. Sometimes we need to sit with the knowledge that we will be in discomfort, but eventually have the conversation that needs to be had. There was a question in the chat, but if I pronounce the name correctly, apologies if I'm not. Sailesh, that the administrative and policy structure which handles environmental issues are highly gendered and hegemonized. Have had you had a chance to have those conversations with the many boys who work with. I'm not fully sure I understand the question. Can you speak a bit more, if possible, what you mean by this?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this beautiful conversation. What I wanted to say is that largely people who would be greatly affected by climate change as we go ahead would be marginalized men and other communities. And their practice of masculinity is marginalized masculinity, and people who are making decisions who are hegemonically practicing a very hegemonic masculinity. And there is this very clear intersectionality between gender and economics there that appears whenever there is any decision or discussion happening around climate change and masculinities per se. Because there is clear inequality of power with both people practicing masculine in a certain way. How does that reflect? Does that issue come up? That intersectionality of economics and gender and decision making. Any insights from that point of view would be really lovely to hear. Thank you.
Niharika, do you wanna go?
So, thank you, Shailesh. I think first thing to flag, I would say, for this question is, especially in the Indian or South Asian context, when we speak of marginalized masculinities in discourse with hegemonic, powerful masculinities, one cannot leave caste out of the conversation. And the fact is that most work happening on masculinities in India is people in power with powerful identities, at least relationally, going into communities of marginalized casted class populations and trying to brain shifts in how they perform masculinities with a very Brahminical lens. So that is one major area, that one major thing that I sit with as a person of privilege, doing this work, as to how these are the things that show up in the system and within non-profit systems themselves is a silent reality that we must start confronting. Um, I think to respond to your question, over the past 2 years, we've run this program called Gender and Masculinities Academy, which has engaged non-profit organizations, including leadership, organization leadership, men in leadership and non-profit organizations, on what masculinities really means. And interestingly, once we did some perspective building and lens building on masculinities, the organization leaders, including the men, started asking the question, how does masculinity show up in our organization culture? Um, and that is where I think I would locate my response to this question, because we see that male representative systems, or systems with majorly men in them, which is a lot of our systems, um, that govern everything from climate frameworks to everything else, are also heavily masculine in nature in terms of being extractive in their approaches, dominating in how they perform masculinity or perform decision making, and they prioritize power and capital over collective care for the self, the others, and the climate, or and the planet, the climate, everything else. um so I think the question that we were asking with this group of NGOs, the bunch of questions we started asking was, how do we define success? How do we look at participation in the systems that we are building? How do we exist with each other? Who are the people existing with each other, and what is relationally changing or shifting as a part of your organization's culture? What do we do in a system when conflict arises? How comfortable are we with slowness, with depth, with complexity? How quick are we to come to conclusions, and hence how are we reflecting on our own hegemonic masculine performances, which we bumped into also very soon. That is something that shows up irrespective of the gender, especially of the organization leader, who's the leader of the system and is building a lot of the pathways in which the system functions, including its policies, its culture, its frameworks, everything. um, and then once we asked this set of questions, uh, beside interrogating how the system can be more inclusive, we also started asking, what is how are the different pieces in the system relating to each other? Who is designing the system, and therefore who is most or best suited to thrive in the system? And of course, we know that a majority of the systems that we all exist in are designed by men, a certain kind of men who hold a lot of intersectional power, and hence those systems are designed to thrive, are designed so that men thrive. Question being, how do they thrive in the system? I think we realize that masculinity show up in an organization's practices in visible and invisible ways, which build pathways for the domination of men over other men, especially from marginalized backgrounds, women, queer folks, and nature. So we sat with questions of how feminist leadership, queering of systems can enable certain shifts in how systems themselves can respond to the ways in which they are reproducing marginalization and oppression. And those are the kind of complex places where our conversations went with many friends. And that answers.
Pierre, do you have Pierre, do you have a brief comment before we go to Paul's question?
Yeah, very brief. I mean, I can't say that I personally have worked in this kind of intersection of men questioning and challenging these broader positions of power, let's say. Though to some extent the men in Cali were doing that, though, by challenging the kind of development paradigm. But what I would say is that there's the guy I quoted at the very end of my presentation, Javier Omar Ruiz Arroyave, who's a masculinities practitioner and also has theorized liberation masculinities and masculinities in the perspective of Buen Vivir. That theory comes from his work with indigenous groups and peasant groups in Colombia, who are marginalized men, not only marginalized from the world, but also marginalized as compared to their own country, Colombia, right? So they have this kind of double stigma or double marginalization. And for me, there's a very interesting potential there because in the case of indigenous groups, and this connects to a comment made earlier, not only do they have this greater knowledge and relationship towards nature and the earth, but they also have the experience, much more vivid and ongoing, of coloniality. So their exercise, let's say, of earth care brings with it, or comes packaged already with both a contestation of our modern, eco-modern understanding of nature, as well as colonialism and coloniality. So this is, theoreticians have spoken about, theorizing from the margins, why don't we center the experience and perspective of marginalized men and masculinities? And I think this really responds to it and shows the potential or the power, let's say, in doing that. And I would call on more of that to be done, both in practice, but also I think there's this bridge that has to be made between practice and also theory, and then contributing, let's say, to theory, so that people who are learning about, who are doing gender studies or masculinity studies at university, have this in their curriculum, and that it's central to the curriculum, not just a kind of add-on at the end.
Thank you. Paul, please.
Well, firstly, hi everybody, and hello Pierre, especially. It's great to see you. And I apologize for missing the first half hour of the presentation. It's middle evening here in Western Australia. It's wonderful to hear people's conversations on the subject and how it's developing in so many different directions. I'm really excited about that. So, more power to us. So go us. And I guess I wanted to just loop back, Pierre, to something that you said that was really interesting to me about raising this question of where are our TikTok, posts? Where are the voices from, quote unquote, our side, as you referred to it, that are being effective at reaching particularly boys and young men. And it seems to me that my experience with the work is that advocating for a feminist perspective, particularly in light of the gains of the manosphere in recent years, is indeed a very long bow. It's very difficult for many boys and men to get past seeing it as nothing short of the blue pill, to use that language. And there's a really deep passion, I think, that's been whipped up from the far right in particular to encourage boys and young men to take the red pill in order to reclaim something nostalgic that's been lost. And one of the things that I've been doing with my work is also experimenting, because I think that those conversations are important to have, of how do you have conversations with people that are very overtly pro-feminist? But then also, how do we, as you were talking about, I think rightly, Pierre, meet people where they are, make a decision to stay in relationship as opposed to being right, and have a conversation with people, boys and young men in particular, who have been influenced by the manosphere, from a place of meeting them in their narcissism. Because I think that that's part of what we're dealing with, is that there's been a huge gain in feeding a narcissistic tendency amongst many boys and young men. And what I mean by that is it possible to have a conversation with an individual where we can help them understand what they are losing for themselves in not only leaning towards a manospheric type agenda, but also the consequences of the climate crisis, and radiate out from there using the protector-provider ethos that has been drummed into and been so effective at gaining so much ground. Use the protector-provider ethos to then actually radiate out from the narcissistic self to the wider scopes of care. And that's something I've been playing with in my work, both theoretically and practically. And I'm just curious about your thoughts on that, responses, coming at it from the other end, leveraging really from this perspective of meeting people certain people where they are.
Pierre, do you want to respond?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think they're very interesting reflections. Sorry, Paul, you caught me off guard. Gosh, yeah. Maybe I'll pass on to Niharika whilst I collect my thoughts. Sorry.
I am collecting my thoughts as well because there are so many. Yeah, but I think yes, as someone who's worked on the ground with boys and men, especially from TikTok and everywhere else, there are a lot of narratives that are challenging to reconcile with when we are in programs. One quick thing I can respond with now, and then I can circle back maybe once Pierre is done, is we've been trying to explore what deep contextualization would mean. So that means because India is in itself such a diverse place, it's a huge, diverse country. Each every 100 meter, 100 kilometers, the language changes, the clothing changes, the norms of masculinities, norms of gender practices, everything changes. So we've been trying to explore what deep contextualization means, if that is a pathway to meeting people where they are, especially since especially work in masculinities is heavily borrowed from the West when being implemented here. Because there's a lot of great work happening in the West that is leading academic work, practitioner work that is leading the discourse at this time and has been for the last decade or two. But that is what we've been trying to figure out, that would using local narratives, local stories, heavily contextualize, heavily understanding what masculinities looks like in that particular context, would that support us? We don't have any answers. This is something we're exploring. But that is just one thing I think that we've been trying to figure in terms of meeting people where they are.
Thank you for saving me. Paul, yes. So narcissism and protector provider. So I think, well, firstly, from the little I know about the manosphere and the documentaries I've seen about it, it seems to me that the boys who are getting entrapped into this thing, I don't know if it's so much narcissism. That might be what gets fueled, but I think the initial motivation is actually wanting friendship, wanting care, to be loved, all these very human things. They're like little boys who just want to be held, basically. And they live in this digitalized, highly digitalized world where they might be bullied at school or whatever. And they just find this community, right, that gives them meaning and purpose and feeds their narcissism, potentially, or inflates it. But I think that's how I read it. I don't know what you think or what others think, but I think that's also, I guess, quite an optimistic reading of it as well, because it means that there are lots of other ways that we can reach and meet these boys, because that's the kind of root need, is a need for care and love and community. Then I think your idea of can we, if I answer correctly, is a question like, can we mobilize the protector provider archetype to serve good? Is that the question? Yeah. And I mean, I think that's the hot topic, I think, within masculinities theory, and it would be interesting to hear from Nahidika if in practice it's also a hot topic, like using this protector provider thing as a kind of strategic essentialism. My intuition tells me that yes, why not? Of course, it depends how it's done, and there's the risk that it just reinforces the hegemonic ideal. But I think it's so ingrained into us, and actually, you have decolonial feminist scholars who talk about this. Decolonial feminist scholars talk about the protector provider archetype is very strong for men in indigenous communities, and they were unable to do this during the during colonization, during the invasion, that they were stripped of this ability, and they couldn't protect their wives, their children, their land, and there's a deep wound because of that. And I think, for me, the question is, could that be extended to, for example, Europe, where we also underwent this process of internal colonization and stripping of our lands, the enclosures, the end of the commons, the witch hunt, like countless women, daughters, wives, partners, mothers were killed, right? So what did that do to men's psyche, and what did it do to our psyche as well, to be stripped of our relationship to nature? We couldn't protect and care for it. So I don't necessarily see the protector caring archetype as a bad one. And yeah, I would be kind of in favor of mobilizing that as a strategy for men. But again, it's a kind of fine line. Erika, what do you think?
Actually, listening to Pierre, I can add a couple of things. uh, I do resonate. I think wanting to belong, understand, care, and love is the way that men are kind of entering the manosphere. But the way that they're reproducing protector and provider was, at least in India, in South Asia, is wanting to survive and find dignity and social mobility in their context, especially what I was saying about caste. That social mobility is such a big part of caste oppressed communities' lives and people's lives. And also there's this, all of us here, I think, experience a lot of fear and insecurity when it comes to finances. There's a lot of fear of poverty. At something akin to what Khurram was saying some time back, I think here we say that we are one health emergency away from not having a roof over our heads. Generally, a lot of us. So I think that position in society, perception, the way people are looking at you, this kind of financial insecurity, all of it leads me to ask the question of, like, something like Jan was saying, right? Letting go of a paying job to kind of go and engage with nature and spend time there. What does it take to be able to do that? Because that is something that someone in a very privileged position in India would be able to do. Otherwise, it's not an option to let go of a paying job, because there are no jobs in the first place. Searching for a job is a huge issue, and it's been a big issue for the last decade in this country. So I think that is one part of it. So protector provider roles, I think, are reinforced there. And also, uh, with it is reconciling the expectation of providing um versus, like, the performance of this kind of masculinity, because there's an expectation of providing and protecting that's coming in from everywhere for a man. And then how much of an onus are we putting on men as individual people to make this shift versus engaging systems and communities to make sure that when the shift happens, or as it is happening, there's also, I wouldn't say the labor of a support system, but at least a system that doesn't hinder these shifts in masculinities for individual men. Yeah.
Yeah, I just got a thought now while listening to you speak, that I think there's also a, protecting and providing is something that women and mothers do too, right? And I think actually the key difference is that traditionally women and mothers have been protecting and providing in reproductive labor, whereas men have been doing the productive labor. So I think maybe that's the division to hold at the heart of this, if we're going to talk about protection and providing, to say, well, actually everybody does that, but what the issue is, that why is it that men are expected and want to have the monetary side only, and why is it that women are expected to have the reproductive side only?
Yeah, deeply, deeply interesting conversation and questions. And again, that's just centuries of, again, devaluing the reproductive labor within a capitalist system, right? And like how, when, if a woman does ask for less than monetary compensation for her care work, then like is immediately said, oh no, that's not something that we can do, that's not something we can give. Whereas the going into the monetary side of care work, eh, within the career system, you're able to monetize that. And that's where then you see men doing cleaning jobs, sometimes starting cleaning companies, in which then they start to hire women and other marginalized folks on the lower levels to do the cleaning, right? And that's where the structural work goes. For example, um, in this is in the narrative caste system, like in Pakistan, when there are advertisements for sewage garbage cleaning jobs, these are only done by Christians, by non-Muslims, right? By people of lower caste. And so this is where there's this constant devaluation of the necessary labor that keeps everything running. And so the protector provider thing, it does tie again back to that idea of the big high salary, and somehow that the CEO's salary is much more important than the janitor. So the gap increases a lot. And there's an excellent economist, Jayati Ghosh, like I would um, definitely urge everyone to listen to, where she talks about exactly that e- our economies are structured in a way that societies are used to support economies and serve economies, rather than the other way around, where the economies are supposed to serve societal goals of health and livelihood and dignity and joy. And from a more climate angle, recently, um, a global economist, Thomas Piketty, many people might be familiar with that name. They recently published this report about what kind of economic growth we should be aiming for to live within the planetary boundaries, within a sustainable economics, global system, environmental system. Uh, Paper of English, I will highly encourage you to read that. We're almost at the end of the session now. I have 8 minutes running. Thank you once again, everyone, for making the time to be here, for engaging, for wonderful discussions. As we close, I had just one last question to both Pierre and Niharika. If you can briefly share, what does what does a gender just world look like to you, right? And it could be something very simple, very small. Um, yeah, what does a gender just, the climate just world look like to you? Like you think is doable, actionable right now, right? Even if that might not happen in the current reality, but can happen and must happen.
That's a big question.
I can give an example if it helps.
Yeah, you go first.
So in I think for me a gender just why would be when we're talking about like in academics, for example, when people go and study gender studies or social sciences or more quote unquote feminine subjects. For me, a gender just world is when at least 50% of the people in those classes are straight men. I think for me that's like a gender just world. When we had that, I think we have really hit the milestone for gender justice, because currently, and I'm no longer like even like South Asia, like even in the global north, even in more progressive countries. So we'll see that in academic spaces like the gender study spaces, because 100% queer people, 100% woman, 100% non-binary, like maybe one straight man sometimes accidentally there. So for me, a gender just world is really where at least that one person goes up to 50%.
All right, I think I can go now. I think for me, a gender just future would be one where neither men nor women have to worry about, let's say for women, they don't have to worry about walking down the street late at night. They don't have to worry about not getting a job because they're a woman. All the worries that they currently have because of their gender would not exist. And similarly for men, men wouldn't have to worry about living up to a specific ideal, nor would they have to worry about women stealing their jobs. So I guess the gender just future would be one in which gender no longer matters in a way. It's not an axis of differentiation, and at the same time, people, whatever their gender, can hold that identity and be proud of it if they want, you know. But it's not, I guess, an axis of differentiation in an unequal sense. Yeah, that's what I would say.
I think mine is really similar to Pierre. Um, and I've said this a few other times, and this is like a very young Gen Z person kind of dream, knowing this will never happen in our lifetimes. But uh, it's that there's for me, a gender just word doesn't exist. It's just a word without gender. I'm a gender abolitionist. I just don't. It's like, to borrow from a friend of mine, there are as many genders as there are stars in the sky, and hence there are no genders at all. So I think that is my imagination of a world where I think not just no equity, no equality, like these conversations don't matter anymore. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful note to end on. And thank you everyone once again for coming, for being with us, for your engagement. And thank you, a big thank you to Pire and Niharika for your wisdom and learning and dialogue and the work that you and everyone else in this room, in this virtual room, is doing in their own ways, in different ways. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.